You are a new 4 player, and for some reason after e4, some guy plays d5. You cut to the pawn back, and they take with the queen. That's a weird move, because they have the queen in the middle of the board at the beginning. Looks like a really bad move, they're going to lose a lot of time trying to run away with the queen, but despite that, you keep losing every time. But don't worry, because after this video, you're going to beat the Scandinavian defense every time. e4, d5, the Scandinavian defense. Now the best move is to take this pawn. If you're wondering what happens if you play e5, well, if you play e5, your opponent usually have 2 moves. They can play bishop on f5, and after you play d4, let's say they play e6, which is, a move that makes a lot of sense. Let's say you play knight on f3, they are going to play probably c6. And if you look at this position, you can see that this is the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann, but this is not the worst thing that can happen, although it's still a thing that might happen. So if you play e5, sometimes you might end up playing a Caro-Kann. The worst thing that could happen though is that they can play c5, and after they play c5, I'm just going to play the main moves. The most played move in this position is f4, computer is suggesting c3. Let's say you play f4 in order to take space, they both make sense. They play knight on c6. At this point you play knight on f3, which is a logical move because, you want to castle. They play bishop on g4, pinning your knight, so you play bishop on e2, obviously. They play e6, let's say. Stockfish is suggesting knight on h6, but e6 is the most played move, and you shouldn't really pay too much attention as Stockfish. I use Stockfish to evaluate complicated position, but it doesn't really understand the opening. So e6 is a much more human move that makes a lot of sense. So if some player play e6, you should play e6. That's me. So at this point they castle, and let's say they play knight on e7, which is a move that makes a lot of sense. You play e3, let's say maybe you play d4, but as you can see in this position, black is better because black has a more solid position than white, has a lot of space. As you see, black is controlling a lot of square. White can't really move his pieces too much. So, you are going to be in trouble for the rest of the game. That's why you shouldn't really play e5. Going back, in this position the best move, and pretty much the only played move, is pawn takes on d5. At this point, you could also play knight on f6, which is the second most played move, and I'm going to cover this line at the end of the video, but the by far most played line is queen takes on d5. Yeah, this looks like a weird move because your opponent is developing the queen in the opening, which usually is a really bad thing. Let's say you play knight on c3, they have to waste time moving the queen, and sometimes they actually play queen on d8. So this looks like a really goofy opening, but is not played at the highest level because you give white a lot of activity, but you need to be careful in this opening. Black has a really solid plan, so if you want to display the Scandinavian and of course not get beaten by it, you have to understand what you're supposed to play. Now, knight c3 is the main line, but in this video I'm going to cover another line, the line that I play, which I consider being better in general. So the line I play is a really strong line against the Scandinavian, and it's knight on f3. After knight on f3, they can answer in 5 different ways. Knight on f6, knight on c6, bishop on g4, e6 or c6. But don't worry, because another good thing of this opening is that with white you usually follow the same plan every time, and it's a pretty logical plan, so you don't have to be worried. The most played move in this position is definitely bishop on g4. You're going to face this move most of the times. It's a logical move. Black is developing the left square bishop, pinning your knight. Now, every time they pin your knight, the only move you play is bishop on e2. It's not the only move, but trust me, every time they do that, just play bishop on e2, your knight is unpinned, and you're going to castle short pretty fast. The plan of black is to castle long, so if we follow the main line, he's going to play knight on c6. If we don't follow the main line, maybe plays knight on f6 and castle short, but don't worry because I'm going to cover that later, and usually a lot of times this opening transpose. This is the only difference because with this line black is actually going to castle long, in the other line is going to castle short. So you need to be careful now, but the plan for white is the same. Nothing absolutely changed. So they develop the knight because they want to castle long. At this point, you don't castle. You don't castle. The really good thing about this opening is that you're going to take a lot of space, like a lot. Yes, they're going to castle long, and this position looks really scary. You might think that you have to castle now. No, you don't even castle now. You play c4. Now, this pawn can't be taken now, because if you take the pawn on d4, obviously I capture your queen with my knight. If you take my knight before, I just capture your queen, so you need to move the queen. Now, the most played move is queen on f5, which leads to a really theoretical variation, and to be honest, I only faced this line one time. No one plays queen on f5. It's a move that they play at GM level, at really high level, I understand that, but usually no one plays that. But I just quickly show you what you are supposed to do, which is a plan that you always play. Bishop on e3 in order to defend this pawn, and the theoretical move is taking the knight with the bishop, which leads to a really complicated variation. No way someone is going to play that. If you want, you can study deeper this line on the Lichess database, but honestly, this is my suggestion. You don't have to worry because no one is going to play this. A logical move in this position is knight on f6. At that point, you just castle short, and they are going to play e5 every time. They play e5, and after they play e5, you always play d5. And as you can see, white is not in trouble. White has good pieces, has a lot of space, and as you can see, white is going to destroy black, because black long castled. Now, Stockfish doesn't agree with me, but trust me, people are not stockfish. They are human, and you are going to destroy them every time. Now, the best move is e4, and you have to know this move is the only thing you have to know, the only complicated thing. But after that, you just play knight on d4, and let's say, if they take the bishop, you just take with the queen. Let's say you take, bishop take, your position is perfect, you have a lot of space, this pawn is weak, you are going to win pretty fast. If they take this knight, which is the best move, bishop takes d4 is the move that has to be played, and now they might play bishop on d6, which looks a bit scary, but at this point you just develop the knight, knight on c3, and you prepare a really strong attack on the long side castle. The best move is taking the bishop, queen take, and you are pretty safe. You don't have to worry about any attack because you just have h3 and you are completely safe. Going back in this position, as I said, is really hard that people are going to play f5. The by far most played move in this position is queen on h5, and the common mistake is playing h3. h3, it's a mistake because you're not threatening the bishop. You're just weakening the king side. If you're going to castle short, this is just a rook now. You can't take the bishop because otherwise you lose the rook. So instead of doing that, as I said, this is a common plan that you are always going to see, if they castle long, you play bishop on e3 and you are completely safe. And at this point, as I said, they always play e5, despite the fact that the queen is not on f5. e5 is still the move, because it's a really tricky move. And remember that every time they play e5, just d5 is the move that has to be played, e4 again, and now you can play knight on d4, although after knight on d4 is not the best line, and the difference is that now there is a battery that looks at this bishop. So let's say the best move is knight on e5, and you need to be really careful because black is getting in. So instead of playing that move, at this point, if they play queen on h5, you play knight on g5. Knight on g5 threatens this. I'm threatening to take your bishop, queen takes, and the fork. So the best move is by far taking the bishop, you take, and queen take we check, and king take. Now, you might think this is a line that doesn't make sense, although the best move is knight on e5, defending this pawn. And as you can see, white is +1. White is +1 because his position is a great position. You are going to win this pawn. I mean, you're really close to win this pawn, and if black wants to defend it, he has to waste a lot of times. Well, in this case, the best move is actually playing knight on f6. If you try to defend this way, I'm getting in with my pieces. There is also bishop on d4, for example. I take your knight and I have the fork, so this move doesn't work at all. The best move is actually h6, which, I mean, looks really wild. So you can understand that this is a really good line for white, a line where you're going to win a pawn. Yes, you have the king in the center, but you can just play, for example, rook on e1 and king on f1, so you basically manual castle, and you have no problem, you have a lot of space, your pieces are much better than black pieces, you're going to win. Now, this line were a little bit crazy, but don't worry because now we are going to see other lines that are going to be much simpler than that. So in this position, if they don't play bishop on g4, which is the most played move, they could play, for example, knight on f6. Knight on f6 in order to castle short. This makes sense. Now, after they play this move, since they still don't have pinned your knight, you don't have to play bishop on e2. So at this point, you still go for the same plan, but just with a different move order. You play d4, d4 taking space, and you're going to play c4 before castling. Now, if they play bishop on g4, it might lead to the same stuff, but I don't think so. Let's say they play bishop on g4, which is the most played move. You play bishop on e2, as I said, and it said that they're going to castle long now because they already wasted time. They get it with c4, and you actually get to castle and maybe play h3. You have a really good position. They shouldn't really castle long, so in this position they might play e6, which makes a lot of sense. And after they play e6, in this position you could play h3, and I mean, I don't see any problem with this move. Let's say you play h3, they might play queen on h5, although queen on h5 doesn't do a lot. You can just castle short and be completely winning probably. And after you play h3, they're going to play bishop on h5, and you castle short. You could also play c4. I would suggest to play c4 because you just gain a time on the queen. The best move is queen on d8. Let's say they play queen on a5. Every time they play queen on a5 in every line, you block with the bishop. Why? Because black has to lose another time moving the queen, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Otherwise, he has to play bishop on b4, and this move is going to be played. At that point, you play knight on c3 now, so you play bishop on d2 first, because you are attacking the queen, forcing this move, basically. At that point, you're going to play a3, bishop takes, bishop take, you have the couple of bishop, you're going to castle short, you have more space, you are much better. If in this position they don't go for bishop on g4, which I mean, sometimes it might happen, I don't know, let's say they want to castle short as soon as possible, they might play e6, although e6 is a bad move now because you block your own bishop. So instead of doing that, let's say they play c6, or I mean, knight on f6 generally is not a good move. It's a good move only if you want to castle long. It's not a good move because you don't have the plan of giving a check with the queen, then playing c6 and going away. c6 usually is a really good move in the Scandinavian, so for this reason, unless you castle long, knight on c6 is just a bad move. So let's say they play c6. You still go for the same plan. Now, your knight is not pinned, so guess what? Instead of playing bishop on e2, you still go for the same plan, playing c4, but with just a different move order. If they play a5, queen on a5 check, which is, I mean, is the point of playing c6 at this point, you always play bishop on d2. Okay, now they can't block with the bishop because they still can't. And the best move is queen on e8. And now you can play knight on c3. If they play bishop on f4, you have knight on h4. This bishop now is just a target. Let's say they play bishop on g6, which makes sense. You're going to take this bishop in the future. At this point, you need to be careful because this pawn is hanging, so you might as well play bishop on e3, develop your bishop on e2, and then castle short. This is a really good plan. Let's say they play e6. You could take this bishop. I will wait a second before taking it, because if you take it now, they take with the h pawn, opening this file for the rook. So we'll wait a second and let's say play a move like bishop on e2 in order to castle short. Let's say they play bishop on e7. At this point you castle, they castle, and now you can definitely take the bishop. They can't take with this pawn because this is really weak. You have ideas of queen on b3, rook on e1, and this pawn is really weak. This is a really bad move. You have to take with this pawn, and as you can see, white has the couple of bishop, has more space, has a better structure, so you are definitely going to play for a win. And if at this point they play bishop on g4, pinning your knight, you could play bishop on e2, but remember that his plan is taking your knight and winning the pawn, so you can play bishop on e3 first. They play e6 in order to castle as soon as possible. You still have h3, they move g4, and the difference now is that this pawn is defended, so you can play knight on e5. Let's say they play bishop on e7 in order to castle as soon as possible. You have h4, and everything is coming, and they're going to be in a lot of trouble. You also have queen on b3, still targeting this pawn. Maybe you could play bishop on g2, and I mean, you have a lot of ideas. I mean, you're not going to castle short, but let's say you could play queen on b3 and castle long. You could also play bishop on g2 and maybe move the king on e1. Looks like a really good try. We saw what happens after bishop on g4 and after knight on f6. What happens after c6? Well, this is pretty similar to the knight f6 line, it's basically the same thing. At this point you play d4 because you still are not pinned. If they play bishop on g4, you have bishop on e2, don't worry. If they play knight on f6 at this point, we're exposed to the line we just saw. So that's it. That's pretty simple. What if in this position they play e6? Well, e6 is a bad move, as I said, because it just blocks the bishop. At this point you can play d4, still d4 is not a problem. I guess that with this move they want to develop the bishop and castle short as soon as possible, so they play knight on f6, which makes sense. You still play c4. This move kinda makes sense, I mean it's still playable, but if they don't have play c6, it's better to slide the queen back, because otherwise you also have to waste time playing c6. So they play queen on d8, and as you can see they are already losing a lot of times. You play knight on c3, they develop the bishop, bishop on e7, and now you can play bishop on e2, or bishop on d3. You can play bishop on d3 because their bishop, I mean, is not moving, is just basically bossed in. And they castle short, you castle short, you have really good space, as you can see, really good pieces. Idea of queen on c2. Okay, queen on c2, b3, and bishop on b2, destroying the king side. And this is really, really good for white. So for this reason, you shouldn't really play e6. Now, computer scene is only +1, but practically speaking, black is going to be in a lot of trouble. As you can see, this bishop is not in the game. They still have to develop the knight and do a lot of stuff. The only move that leads to a slightly different position is knight on c6. Now, knight on c6 is quite a sideline, because at this point, white does not go for d4. If you go for d4, the point of this move is playing e5 and leads to a completely different position, which is really tricky. You're probably going to play queens. I wouldn't really suggest this position. So for this reason, instead of playing d4, you play knight on c3, attacking the queen. You might think, but isn't this the main line with knight on c3? No, it's not the main line with knight on c3. Let's look at the most played move, which is queen on a5. You can see that there is a big difference. They have a knight on c6, which is not good. Knight on c6 is not good because, as I said, in this position you want to play c6. The knight is blocking c6, so the queen can't run away. The queen is a huge target now. And it's not only that, this knight can be a target, and the best move is playing bishop on b5. In fact, pinning the knight. They play bishop on d7, pretty much the only move. And at this point, you play d4. d4 trying to target this knight. a6 is definitely a move. If they play a6, you take, bishop take, and you short castle. If they castle long, you play knight on e5, threatening the bishop. They have to move the bishop, otherwise you take, and the scatter is really, really bad. The best move is bishop on e8, which is, I mean, you can see this is a really, really bad position. And now you play b4. b4 and black gets totally destroyed. This is not a sack of a pawn. If they take this pawn, you have queen on f3. Threatening to take there, threatening to get in with the rook on b1. The knight is defended. This position is really, really bad. The best move, don't know why, but is queen on b6. Rook on b1, obviously. Queen on a7 is the move. And now you can take this pawn. You could also play bishop on e3. The best move is taking the pawn. They take, queen take. And as you see, I mean, all the pieces are blocked. Is a really bad position. If you take this pawn at this point, as have queen on f3 again, and is +7 because, let's say, you try to develop pieces, don't even know how. Let's say you play e6, there is queen takes on b7. This is a huge threat, and black is going to lose pretty fast, don't worry. And if they don't play a6 in this position, they just going to castle long. You castle, and at this point they still play a6 because this bishop is really annoying and you transpose in the same identical position. So this is pretty good for white. Instead of playing queen on a5, which still is the most played move, sometimes they could play queen on h5, which loses to knight on b5. Threatening this, the best move is king on d8, d4, and you already see that this position is really messed up. Instead of doing that, the last move that I'm going to show you, I mean, they could play queen on d8, but again, I just develop every piece, you get destroyed, is queen on d6, you play d4, queen on d6 I think is the best one, it's logical at this point. They play knight on f6, You have ideas of knight on b5. Let's say you play knight on b5, queen d8. They have to waste a lot of time. c4, getting in, e6, bishop on e2 is a move. You play bishop on e2 because you want to push this pawn, so you want this pawn to be supported by your queen. Bishop on e2, let's say bishop on e7, castle short, and again bishop on e3, and as you can see, white has a lot of space. These pieces are much better. This bishop is blocked in again, so you have a lot of winning chance. And now, if you're still watching, you might also wondering what happens if they play knight on f6. Knight on f6, targeting this pawn. Can you still play the same stuff? Well, this is a really good thing about playing this opening, that the best move in this case is knight on f3. So it basically leads to really similar opening what I show you. So it's going to be pretty simple for you if you play the knight f3 line in general. If they play with the queen with exposed to the same stuff, to a knight f3 line. So if your opponent tries to surprise you with this move order, you have absolutely zero problem, because it's not a surprise, it's your opening preparation at this point. You play d4, as I said. If they play this, you play c4. If they play this, you play bishop on e2. It's the same stuff, a line that I showed you before. If they take with the knight, you still play d4, and you still have the same plan. You want to play c4. If they pin you, you are still going to play bishop on e2, obviously. e6 is the best move. Play c4, the knight has to move. You can play h3, at this point the bishop has to move, and again the bishop is a target now. You could play g4, if you want to be more solid you can just castle. They're going to play knight on c6, bishop on e3 makes sense, b3 also makes sense, knight on c3 makes sense. You have a lot of stuff that you can play, you absolutely have no problems. Now if you think that this pawn is a bit weak, well, you can just play b3. They're going to play queen on d7 because they want to castle long and target this pawn, and you can play bishop on b2. And who is going to target this pawn? Absolutely no one, because let's say they castle long and you absolutely have no problem at this point. I don't know, you might play knight bd2, defending this pawn more because they are threatening to take this knight. So if they take now, you just take and you have absolutely zero problems. And they can't take this pawn because you take, bishop take, queen take. And after all of this happens, you can't take the knight because he's defended by the bishop. So your pawn is still safe, they castle long, and they're going to get destroyed probably pretty fast. If they play a different move, then bishop on g4, the most played move in this position is actually g6. You play c4, targeting the knight has to move. So knight on b6 obviously is the move. If you're wondering what happens if they play such a move, there is queen on a4. So they had to play knight on b6, knight on c3, bishop on g7, targeting this pawn, and you don't have to worry now, you can play c5. The point of c5 is that after they play this, which I mean is a move that has to be played, you have bishop on c4. Thanks to c5, now this square is free with the bishop on c4. Now your bishop is pretty good, is much better than usual. They can't play bishop on g4 now because they just lose a knight, by the way. So they can, I mean, they kinda have to play this move, c6. You castle short, they are going to castle short. And at this point you can play bishop on g5, developing every piece you have. Let's say h6, you just go back, it's not a problem. And if they play to pin your knight at this point, well, you can play h3, and if bishop take, queen take, and they can't take this pawn, because if they do that, they're going to take the knight, they take back, and let's say you take this pawn with the bishop, this pawn is going to be under attack pretty soon. You have a huge pressure on the king side, you have also pressure on this rook. You have rook on e1 coming, rook on d1 pinning the bishop coming, and this is a completely winning position. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you like this video and that you learned a lot of things. This video took me a lot of time to do, so please consider liking and subscribing, and see you in the next video.